G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Kaitlyn and I'm an American learning to live down under here in beautiful Sydney, Australia. One of the things I knew I was going to have to learn when I came over here was the metric system. Like pretty much the rest of the world, Australia uses the metric system, whereas America uses the imperial system. So that was quite a big shock for me coming over here. I still haven't mastered it, but I've become a lot more familiar with the metric system in the 6 months I've been living here. So today I'm just going to share some of the stories that I have, what it's like actually trying to learn a completely new system of measurement over here, the few times I've actually used the metric system over in the States. So grab a Bicky, grab a cuppa, and let's jump right into the video. Before we get into this video, I want to give a huge special thank you to today's sponsor. You know them, you love them, and they are Arnotts biscuits. Arnotts is known as being the Australian biscuit company. I know so many Aussies who have grown up with Tim Tams, Scotch Fingers, Ice Vovos, the works in their pantry growing up. Arnotts has been part of Aussie homes since 1865. Their products are trusted by millions of Aussies all across the globe. And even some non-Aussies like myself. I absolutely love Arnotts biscuits. They are so tasty, they're so good. They have such a huge variety of them. And coming from an American who's used to having a variety of snacks, you will never get tired with the selection of biscuits that Arnotts has. Every Aussie knows Arnotts biscuits. They've grown up with them, they love them. These are treats that have been savored for generations over here in Australia. So thank you so much to Arnotts for sponsoring today's video. So if you haven't already, grab an Arnotts Bicky, grab a cuppa, and let's jump right into this video. So learning the metric over here was incredibly frustrating. I can't tell you how many times I've had to pull out my phone to figure out how far something was. It would say kilometers, and then I'd have to Google conversions to kilometers to miles so I could understand what it was. I'm still doing this today. It was so frustrating coming over here and cooking and trying to figure out what the oven temperature needs to be, because I didn't realize that 180 degrees is probably close to 350 degrees. Something as simple as cooking dinner became very, very frustrating my first few weeks over here. I had my phone on me constantly to do conversions, whether it was Fahrenheit to Celsius, whether it was converting cups into milliliters, whether it was converting ounces to grams. There are so many little things that I think a lot of Aussies take for granted, because they already know this, they grew up with this, they're familiar with this. So being a little bit more patient with Americans when it comes to really understanding the metric system goes a long way. This is something that is really unique to a lot of Americans because there are only 3 countries in the world that use the imperial system: the US, Liberia, and Myanmar. And how many people from Liberia and Myanmar do you think are traveling over to Australia compared to people in America? America has a huge population, so this is something that is very unique to people from just those 3 countries. And to be honest, I haven't really had to use the metric system since I learned about it in 5th grade. I used it a tiny bit in high school chemistry, but that was it. Afterwards, I didn't really need to use the metric system for anything. Everything is in the imperial system over in the US. In fact, the only times I could remember really seeing the metric system on anything was for 2-liter bottles of Coke, for any type of alcohol, whether it was like a 750 milliliter bottle of wine or a 1-liter bottle of wine, or when it came down to prescription medications, taking 25 milligrams of something every day, taking a 200 milligram tablet of ibuprofen, which is pretty similar to Nurofen over here in Australia if you didn't know. And on top of that, Americans aren't the most precise when it comes to measurements in a lot of just general areas of everyday life. If we wanted a soda, we wouldn't say we wanted a 12-ounce can or a 16-ounce bottle. We'd either say we wanted a can, a bottle, or a 2-liter. Those are the typical sizes that they came in. So we weren't even really worried about the measurements per se. It was basically a small, medium, and large when it came to those types of things. On top of that, if you look at just even a basic American recipe, a lot of Americans don't weigh their ingredients. Everything is measured out in quarter cups and tablespoons. It's very rare to find on an American cooking blog recipes that break things down into full and proper measurements. If you need 250 grams of flour, if you need 50 mils of milk, it's not going to break everything down with those American websites. So many of them are obviously catered towards Americans. Everything's broken down into cups and tablespoons and teaspoons. Stuff that you only need a dry measuring cup, a wet measuring cup, and measuring spoons for. I know so many Americans who don't weigh their ingredients. So unless they're very into baking, have been professionally trained in the culinary industry, or are very, very health conscious and measure everything out and also probably measure macros and whatnot, your typical average American doesn't really measure their food. So this is something that's been pretty new to me over here. I never really measured, and I'm somebody who's been baking since they were a kid. It wasn't really something that I ever thought of, something I considered. I always thought it was something that you only really needed to do if you were making a huge amount of cakes or cupcakes, or you owned a bakery or something like that. It didn't really occur to me until I was probably in about my 20s, to be honest, that a lot of people do measure their food, or they'll measure out ingredients. Having a food scale over here in Australian kitchens is very common and something that I had to get used to over here. When I hit 21 and was able to actually legally buy alcohol over in the States, that's when I noticed that a lot of the bottles are sold in milliliters. You have 750 milliliter bottles of wine or 1 liter bottles of wine. You have spirits in various different sizes. The only thing that still remained pretty consistent was a can of beer was the same as a can of Coke, so typically 12 ounces. But if you go to bars and restaurants, shots aren't measured out the same way that they are over here in Australia. If you go to a pub over here in Australia, they still measure things out pretty regularly. Whereas over in the States, I knew quite a few bartenders who were generous pourers. You won't really find shot glasses in a lot of the smaller pubs over in the States. Especially dive bars, I would be shocked if you actually found a shot glass for measuring over in a dive bar in the States. And in order to sell to international audiences, a lot of American wineries and distilleries will cater towards international audiences, because Americans aren't going to suddenly stop purchasing a bottle of wine just because it comes in milliliters instead of ounces. So it helps to cater to international audiences instead of coming up with separate labels that need to be printed and separate packing methods and separate bottling methods. It's so much easier for distilleries and breweries over here to just use the metric system, because the rest of the world uses the metric system, and it makes it a lot more easier and convenient to sell to international audiences, because they know the reality is, at the end of the day, Americans aren't going to stop buying their products just because it's in a metric system label compared to an imperial system label. There are very few areas in America where you're going to see the metric system regularly. And from what I've researched, from what I've seen, and what I've personally experienced, I know that those areas tend to typically either be in medicine, in engineering, to some degree construction, and in the military. Obviously, medicine is something that is international. A lot of researchers from different countries will collaborate and work with each other. So it's very, very common for a lot of medical textbooks to be in metric. Most people who go to med school study in the metric system. It's something that's a little bit more precise and a lot easier for other countries to understand. Especially if you're talking about shared research and whatnot, it's just more convenient, it makes more sense. Well, granted, metric does make more sense in general, but in medicine it's very common to use the metric system. But in medicine, they use the metric system. Everybody else abroad does, and obviously there's shared research and whatnot, so it makes sense for medical professionals to all be at least using the same system of measurement. Same thing with the military. Obviously, America and Australia have a pretty strong military alliance, along with many other countries in the world, and the vast majority of countries use the metric system. So it makes sense for the American military to use the metric system along with these other countries. The American military cooperates regularly with so many other countries that it makes sense for them to be on the same page when it comes to things like measurements. So America once tried to start using the metric system and implement it back in the 60s into the 70s. So in 1968, there was a 3-year study called the U.S. Metric Study. And this study determined whether or not it would be feasible for America to convert over to the metric system, if America would ever be on track with the rest of the world when it came to the metric system. And while overall that study was positive, and in 1975, Congress passed the Metric Conversion Act of 1975, as we know, clearly that didn't pan out. So despite Congress's attempts, America never converted over to the metric system. So that's it for this video, you guys. It's kind of what it's like trying to learn the metric system over here in Australia. It's a little bit confusing. I still don't have it down pat, but I know I will get there eventually. So if you like this video, hit the like and subscribe button down below to join our little Amer-Australian family. I post on Mondays and normally Thursdays about the differences between American and Australian culture and the overall process of learning to live down under. Of course, right as I'm finishing this up, Snaps decides to come over and say hello to everybody. My name's Kaitlyn, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!